2014 to a referendum for independence. And we lost that 45% to 55%. But remember, for all my lifetime, only about 25% of people in Scotland supported independence. So the fact that in the referendum period, we got it to 45, in fact, we got it over 50% in the polls just before the 2014 referendum on independence, when, of course, the big parties in London suddenly offered full federalism, which never happened. But we got 45%. Now, but more important, what 2014 meant was, and the reality of 2014 is that there was a huge popular movement emerged in the housing schemes, in the small towns, essentially a working class movement demanding independence. A city like Glasgow, the most working class city in the UK, voted overwhelmingly for independence, right? Dundee, major working class city in Scotland, voted for independence. The mass movement in 2014 got away from the parties, got away from the SNP. It was a movement from below demanding independence, but independence to fight austerity, Tory austerity. A huge mass movement we haven't seen anywhere in the UK this side of World War II. And though we lost the referendum just immediately after the referendum, 100,000 people joined the SNP, mass movement for independence, propelled by demand for a different kind of Scotland, a social Scotland. Right, what happens then? Nicola Sturgeon takes over the SNP. Now, I'm now going into contentious areas which some people will disagree with, but fine, and we can have a debate on that. Under Sturgeon, the SNP has started to move to the right. It's trying to win middle-class votes, particularly people who voted yes to remaining in the EU in the 2016 European referendum. Now, of course, if you move, trying to hold the most fiat and conservative elements of the middle class means you have to tone down everything else. And so the SNP brings in a corporate lobbyist to write its economic program. It brings in some of the most right-wing pro-capitalists to write its pandemic, post-pandemic reform program. So the SNP has moved to the right, and that has led a lot of other things involved. Alex Salmond, we all know that, but essentially the split has come. People setting up Alba because they see the SNP moving to the right, and because also they see the SNP downgrading the demand for independence in favour of, we'll wait till Boris Johnson gives us the right to hold another referendum. There can be no plan B. We just have to wait. And of course, Boris is not going to grant an order to allow another Scottish independence referendum, certainly not in the short run, and certainly not with lots of caveats, such as being discussed, extending the vote to people living in England, adding other questions to the referendum, and so on and so on. So frustration has propelled us and propelled a lot of the movement to seek something else. So, and that has relevance for Ireland, because I think the democratic demand to be allowed to vote on a constitutional status of Scotland and Northern Ireland will become a key issue. And that can unite people who don't want independence. The democratic right is as important as how you choose. And I think one of the things we're doing is to try and build up a cross alliance of people who might balk at independence, who might want federalism, fine. But the issue is who chooses. It has to be the people of Scotland, the people of Northern Ireland, who get to do the choosing. Right. Let me just wrap this up. We're looking here in Scotland about what happens if we don't get allowed to hold a referendum. It will certainly lead, I think, to more demonstrations post-pandemic. There's a lot of talk about peaceful civil disobedience and how we pressure. Meanwhile, in England, here's the problem. I'll finish on this. The problem in England is that the frustration and the austerity of the last decade has led to an explosion of English nationalism, particularly in north of England. Now, unfortunately, some of that is being pushed in a right-wing direction, right-wing populist direction by people like Farage. Right. Some of it is actually much more progressive. I think some of the vote against the EU in 2016 north of England was quite progressive. As people saying, we're frustrated, we want to control our own lives. And it's also clear that the north of England is having tensions with the south, because we've seen the emergence in the last few weeks of a north of England independence party. Don't know if that will get deep roots, but it's indicative of a desire in the north of England to control their own lives. And it's that desire, that democratic desire, that we can all latch onto. So final point is, I think the different movements doing their own thing also have to consider how they coordinate, or at least discuss with each other. The progressive wing of English nationalism, Scottish nationalism, Welsh nationalism, which I haven't talked about, which has seen a sudden flowering, and of course what's going on in the north. It's a common problem. It's the decay and breakup of the British state. Well, let's all get together and hasten that.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you for such an informative and important reminder of how a mass movement for independence emerged in 2014. I think there are very important lessons here on the island of Ireland about the importance of socialists pushing for an alternative vision of what this place can be. Very grateful to you for joining us. Our next speaker is Eulàlia Reguant, a councillor for the Catalonian CUP party in Barcelona. We're very grateful to you, Eulàlia, for joining us today and sharing some of the experience of socialists in Catalonia pushing for independence. Thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting us. First of all, I think it's a need that we have all over the world, just to share experiences and to know better each other. I will start talking about the process of revoking the constitution in Spain and of course in Catalonia, and then I would like to talk a little bit about the CUP, the Popular Unit Candidacy, and the self-determination and the independence fight that we are trying, or how we are trying to push, or the things that happened the last years here in Catalonia. I will read because it's easiest for me to do it then in English, because I'm always thinking in Catalan, so if I need to translate it, it will be horrible for you, at least. About the process of revoking the constitution, the Spanish constitution, when you search for the word constitution on the internet, several different definitions appear. Some are very legal and relate to the state, while others relate to the guiding principles of society. Beyond the world of lawyers, it can be said that the constitution is a set of basic rules that determines the rights and duties of citizens. And that's, for us, that's really important. In fact, I said this because in fact the political crisis between Catalonia and Spain has much to do with the 1978 constitution, how it was drafted and how it has been developed over time. A large part of the population has reached the conclusion that the 1978 constitution has expired and that we need a new one that reflects modern society. It should be kept in mind, in fact, that the Spanish constitution, which has been written as an agreement between the leading parties, was supervised by the military and drafted as the systematic repression of political dissident continued, including killings by fascist groups at that moment. The huge percentage of votes that the constitution received should be understood in this context. The people vote for it under the constant threat of a coup, police violence, and action from military police. For years, we have been sold the idea that lawyers drew up the constitution guided by the fathers, what we say, the fathers of the constitution. And could we reject this? And we had fought for the constitution to be reopened as a participatory process. We have brought different participatory examples to the table, including Iceland, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador constitutions in which the demands of social movements are included using the same methods of direct participation as the constitutional process. The experience in which many people in the CUP have participated, in CUP has participated, such as popular legislative initiative against GMOs, the ones for the abolition of bullfights, the ones against evictions due to the energy poverty, the one for a new educational system, and the multi-referendum are convincing evidence that the social movements have knowledge and proposals for social advancement. They are also proof of the resistance against technocrats, politicians who dress up their technical impartially in a role that serves the elites, and accepting the popular will. This is important at that moment if we see what's going to happen with the new crisis and the new austerity, although EU is saying that nothing like this is going to happen. Apart from the inalienable right of people to decide their future that has been defended by revolutionary traditions and the undeniable progressive nature of breaking away from the Bourbon monarchy to get rid of the political influence of the bishops and the church, getting rid of the army, leaving NATO, questioning the framework of war and capital in Europe, being able to apply the law against evictions and energy poverty, and many other examples, independence offers the real possibility of holding a social discussion on how we will collectively manage our lives. We know that the elites want to preserve the status quo, to maintain the conditions that make them richer and more powerful every day. This means that the Spanish Constitution is very difficult to reform without the agreement of conservative members of parliament. In addition, this constitution does not recognize the ability of the population either to encourage constitutional change or to be consulted in binding referendum to decide on the key issue. Everything that we are suggesting or that we suggest with this will not be possible without social activity or without the organized power of the people. And this is what for us it's really important. But talking about the CUP and the self-determination process as a main thing, over the last few years, we have witnessed the erosion of the autonomous system that emerged out of the transition for the fascism to democracy. It has become clear that this situation does not give an outlet to popular politician aspirations, and it does not even allow for minimal recognition of different national realities or the right of self-determination. And because the persistent work of the pro-independence movement has cleared the way, what was once seen as a utopia began to take shape up to the 1st of October with a referendum on self-determination, a political tool supported by a very broad spectrum of Catalan society, and that aimed to resolve the democratic conflict with the Spanish state. The path taken by the Popular Unity candidacy, the party over the years, has been based on maintaining the historical claim by the pro-independence left in defense of the right to self-determination. It was the referendum that allowed us to reunite the popular will of the majority expressed on the streets with the need to open locks that until now were without a key. Today, it is still imperative that together with claiming the right to self-determinate, we open spaces to build the nation of the Catalan countries, because the referendum was just for Catalonia, and we work as Catalan countries in the political, economic, social, and cultural spheres, and to consolidate existing ones. I want to just remember that the Catalan countries are Catalonia, Balearic Islands, Valencia, and the north of Catalonia, that's in the south of the French state. Today, it's more necessary than ever that from baseline of respect to diversity and plurality, the political, social, and cultural agents commit to building the Catalan countries and to defending them against the recentralizing offensive by the Spanish and the French states. And that today more than ever, and perhaps precisely because of the way the referendum of the 1st of October turned out and its consequences then and now, we need to assert to the world that we must have recognition for our right to self-determination, which must be solidified, if necessary, with a new referendum and with a binding vote as a democratic right, and also as an instrument to prevent conflict faced with prohibition from a demophobic state. Voting remains a valid alternative. If we are still saying today that we cannot expect anything from the Spanish state, then we must be aware that the only democratic alternative is widespread institutional and civil disobedience. That's what we made the 1st of October, and it's still needed to gain independence. Accepting this fact entails even now accepting all the political and legal consequences as we are now facing. Today, we can reflect on the roadmap that has been drawn up and consider the new paths that were opened up by the escalation of events. Failing to make the referendum binding, or rather, failing to deploy the entire framework of civil disobedience once the result of the referendum were known, has created new perspectives and a new political cycle that may lead us away from a resolution in independence terms, and that put us on a battlefield full of different hypotheses and uncertain solutions. Today, the pro-independence left and the coup will keep their ideological and strategic approaches on the table with the aim of providing the possibility of breaking away from Spain, the right to self-determination from the autonomous communities. The right to self-determination was not meant to be at that moment and can never be a legal transition from the autonomous communities to a republic without touching the power of the ruling classes. Political autonomy in Catalonia has historically been consolidated through coexistence and the agreement within the ruling classes of Catalonia and the Spanish state. That is why they are part of the same structure and why it's necessary through the existence of the right to self-determination to open the door to the possibility of recovering sovereignty and rights in much broader sense. We must therefore keep on raising the political program that we have, the political program of the coup, to demand, as we said not long ago, to change everything and to decide everything. The right to self-determination and the concrete exercise of this right also requires creating new institutional frameworks that are alternative to the current system. At the same time, there must be an increased level of mobilization in defense of self-determination in social terms, mass general strikes, grassroots occupations of the main state infrastructures, the intervention of the most important companies, and permanent and one-off occupations of the public space. And just to finish, for us, if we are to break the Spanish state and build a social alternative, we need the necessary answer to the question of what is to be done. And today we defend the right to self-determination while demanding the independence of the Catalan countries, standing shoulder to shoulder with feminism and socialism. Because for us, what is not decided by us will be decided by the others.
Eulàlia, thank you so much. Again, another powerful call for action for socialists across Europe to think of the fight for self-determination really as a fight against the politics of the establishment and as a wonderful opportunity to demand change and rights in a broader sense, to demand a just society that is of our making. So thank you very much for sharing the experience of comrades in Catalonia. Our next speaker is Richard Boyle Barrett. Sorry, I just stepped for a second because I think I thought I had frozen. I thought my screen was frozen. Anyway, our next speaker is Richard Boyle Barrett, TD for People Before Profit. Richard, over to you.
Hi, Vanka, thanks. And thanks to our two previous contributors. I mean, obviously the context for this this conference that we've organized is that we are in a very exciting and in our lifetime sort of unprecedented situation where the ending of partition, the unification of the island, a border poll is actually now something that is very seriously on the agenda. I mean, you know, obviously the issue of partition has been on the agenda for the entirety of the existence of our state, or the two states that were partitioned in 1922. But with Brexit, with the crisis of unionism, that is developing apace, that we now in a very, very serious and real way are facing a situation where unification and ending partition and a poll to achieve that are a realistic prospect in the next few years. And for our part in People Before Profit, we are absolutely clear that socialists have to put themselves absolutely centrally in leading the fight for a border poll, for ending partition, and for unification on this island. Now, I think why a meeting like this is terribly important to set that battle campaign that we have in front of us, to set it in a wider international context of partition, how it operates internationally, or movements for self-determination, or the denial of the right to self-determination for whether it's people in Scotland or Barcelona, or the Kurdish people, or the Palestinian people, or more generally fighting against partition, is because I think some of those who will oppose us will try and suggest that seeking to unite Ireland is essentially a divisive and narrow, conservative, nationalistic project that the left shouldn't have any great interest in. Certainly we know that, you know, the DUP and so on will talk about how the reunification of Ireland is a sort of threat to people from a Protestant background, people of the unionist tradition. But also I think people down here will sort of try and present and have historically presented those who are in favor of ending partition and uniting the Ireland as a sort of right-wing nationalist project, and potentially one that people of a progressive ilk should be suspicious of and concerned about. And I think it is critical, and I should say, of course, some elements of nationalism will play into that, concern, precisely because for them, reunification, ending partition, for some at least, is based on some sort of national ideal, rather than actually being something that is about ending division and fighting for a different, better, more equal, progressive society, and that it is linked, if you like, to the fight the fight for socialism. And I think it's important to put it in that context, because that's not often how it's seen. I think that international picture is important in that regard. And I'm always struck in that regard by, I think, to my mind, the most sharp characterization of what partition is about was interestingly put forward by a guy called Sir Ronald Storrs, who was the Governor General of Jerusalem in 1936, the most powerful British military figure in Jerusalem in 1936, in the run-up to the establishment of the Israeli state in Mandate Palestine. And I think he put the sort of logic of partition and its malign logic brilliantly when he said that what they wanted to create in Palestine was a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. And in a single sentence, Ronald Storrs, who also self-described himself as the first military governor general of Palestine since Pontius Pilate, which I thought was sort of interesting, but he tells us something very, very interesting, that the logic of partition, which led to the disaster, which was the establishment of the Israeli state, was part of a very conscious, malign project of divide and rule, of denying the aspiration of self-determination for the entirety of the Arab world, who at that time and in the years previously had been fighting for self-determination to break the grip of empires, the Ottoman Empire, but then the great powers that were carving up the Middle East in the early part of the 20th century. But Storrs really setting out that the logic of partition is to divide and rule, to deny the legitimate aspirations for self-determination of the Arab people, and to set people against one another. And that the model for doing that was one that was developed in Ireland, and that they were going to export, and of course did export that model to the carve up of the Middle East, with the absolutely disastrous consequences that happened not just for the Palestinian people, but indeed with British diplomats like Sir Percy Cox, who literally drew up the lines with a ruler on the map that created the modern Middle East to divide and rule the entire region. And in a similar way, the Sykes-Picot agreement, which had divided up the Middle East between British and French spheres of influence, with the disastrous consequences for Lebanon, the disastrous consequences for the Kurdish people whose national aspirations were simply excluded, denied in that Sykes-Picot agreement, and the consequences, you know, we are still feeling them today, the disastrous consequences for the entirety of the region, and that the logic of it was a conscious logic to divide and rule. And indeed, in meetings like this, I'm always quoting unlikely figures from the Governor General of Jerusalem, you know, and his malign logic. But another interesting person in this regard is Edmund Burke, of course, the Irish statesman who was an implacable opponent of the French Revolution. But even he could see what the malign logic of denying national aspirations and the machine to do it, the apartheid divide and rule machine that had been developed in Ireland in order to crush, if you like, the people of Ireland in order to secure British rule. And he brilliantly described the penal laws, which were, if you like, a forerunner of the apartheid laws of the Israeli state. He described them brilliantly as a machine of wise and elaborate connivance, as well fitted for the impression oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of the people, and the debasement in them of human nature itself, as ever proceeded from the perverted ingenuity of man. Quite extraordinary description, but absolutely apt in terms of, you know, prioritizing the rights of Protestants in order to secure the allegiance of one group in order to divide everybody and secure control of the island in the interests of, if you like, the emerging British, the British Empire. And I just think that context is important to say, therefore, fighting for national self-determination and ending partition, far from being, if you like, a conservative project or a sort of narrowly nationalist project, is in fact a project to overcome division, to challenge empire and the perverse connivances of empire to divide ordinary people against one another in order to control them. And of course, Connolly, similarly, I quote somebody slightly more progressive, you know, put it brilliantly when he said, partition of this island would lead to a carnival of reaction north and south. Very importantly, the foundation of two right-wing reactionary states. And of course, that's what we got. We got the horror of the Orange State with the you know, institutionalized systematic oppression of the Catholic population, the division of Catholic and Protestant workers set at each other's throats, and an equally reactionary Catholic right-wing state with all the horrors of the Magdalen laundries, of the industrial schools, of the mother and baby homes, of, you know, the rotten corruption of a state dominated by two right-wing parties with incredibly weak left and working class movement. That was the result of partition. And I just think it's very important for us to put that context in explaining why socialists must fight for a border poll, fight against partition. It's not out of some sort of narrow nationalistic conception of the country we're fighting for, quite the opposite. It is about uprooting the structures of divide and rule that were devised by an empire and indeed used across the world to divide people, to weaken them, to control working class people, and to secure the control of countries, regions, and resources for a tiny wealthy elite. Now that's by way of sort of historical background, but I do think it's important because, if you like, that I think in many ways this debate will be presented as the opposite of that by some. That in fact we are the divisive ones by even calling for a border poll. And I think we have to put that alternative context and say it is actually partition that is the divisive institution and structure which guarantees on an ongoing basis the perpetuation of sectarianism and strengthens the forces of the right, the conservative forces, both north and south, and that ending partition actually opens up the possibility of a very different type of Ireland, which is about uniting Catholic and Protestant to fight against those reactionary states that exist in the north and south and that have done nothing for working class people, that have been a disaster for women, have been a disaster for minorities, that have kept working class people down and at each other's throats when their best interests are served by uniting and fighting for a better and more equal society. And just to conclude, I think that, you know, what does all that mean in terms of the campaign that we have to wage? I think we have to say that that's precisely why we want to end partition, because we want to end that terrible division. We want to overcome sectarianism, and that the way that will be done is by uniting the progressive forces, north and south, Catholic and Protestant, men and women, gay and straight, black and white, that it is in the interest of all of the oppressed, of working class people to fight for a united Ireland and to end the horror of partition, and that we have to show that in practice, that that is the case by, if you like, putting issues like fighting racism, north and south, at the center, solidarity with Palestine, fighting for an all-Ireland national health service where, you know, something that, if you like, the COVID crisis has highlighted the desperate need and the interest we have in having an all-Ireland health service that actually provides for the health and welfare of ordinary people, and more generally, you know, whether it's the right to housing north and south, whether but a progressive society that actually meets the needs of the majority of people, and that we should, as George said, avoid what the SNP leadership, if like, are doing, who imagine that the way in which to win people to the project of national self-determination is somehow to cuddle up to the right-wing forces, to tone down the radical demands for a different socialist Ireland, for for ending oppression, for redistributing the wealth. We have to do the exact opposite of that. We need to wage a campaign from the bottom up, which is about uniting working class people with demands for radical change in Irish society to redistribute the wealth and to end discrimination and oppression.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to all of the speakers, to George, to Eulàlia, and to Richard for presenting the socialist vision of fighting partition and demanding self-determination and independence in the name of a life that is determined by us and works for us, and specifically on the island of Ireland for uniting working class people to demand an Ireland that is better and far more progressive. So thank you very much to all of the speakers and to all of you who participated in this plenary session.